Let me tell you a story. Once upon a time, 10 years ago, when Undertale first came out, the fandom had a very codified, fanon interpretation of the cast. To an extent, this is still true. Communities tend to centralize as they grow, and this is just how fandoms work, but back in ye olden days, it was practically law. The main 8 characters, 9 or 10 if you count Frisk and Kara, were basically flattened and flanderized into these one-sentence caricatures of their in-game counterparts. Kara is the evil child, Frisk is the good child, Papyrus is the wholesome small bean, and Alphys was an irredeemable witch that deserved to rot and die. Oh, and of course, there was Toriel, who was everyone's unproblematic fave goat mom. 10 years down the line, Toriel is now a terrible parent in the eyes of many. What happened? Well, a few things. For one, Deltarune happened, and for another, 10 years makes a big difference, and with Chapter 4 just behind us showing Toriel at perhaps her lowest, a lot of people seem to feel very blindsided by her. So now that we are Undertale fans who can read, allegedly, and with the game's 10-year anniversary upon us, which is insane to say quite honestly, let's re-examine Toriel in both Undertale and Deltarune and ask the question, is Toriel a bad parent actually? Short answer, no. Long answer, it's complicated. Let's get into it. So, as I said in the intro, because Undertale had a fandom that skewed very young, a lot of people interpreted characters in a very face value way, and Toriel, despite her apparent flaws, was one of the good ones, TM. However, unlike characters like Alphys or Kara, whose depth is more expanded upon, I can understand why an audience of largely kids missed out on the nuances of Toriel's character playing Undertale. After all, she ceases to exist between Snowdin and the very end of the game, and she's almost entirely a force for good in the beginning part, saving us from Flowey and guiding us through the ruins and giving us a new home. After fighting her, she just kinda sends Frisk on their merry way with a pat on the head, despite her apparent misgivings about what will happen to them. And I want to start here because this is really the root of Toriel's flaws that we'll see expanded upon more in Deltarune. She has this very binary approach to parenting where she's either bordering on helicopter parent or isn't super emotionally available. So while I don't blame her for it, I feel as if Toriel could have done more than just throw her hands up and be like, hope you don't die, to Frisk. She could have left the ruins open, as we know she has the ability to do, or stopped leaving me on red whenever I try to call her. But I think it's time we moved on to the true pacifist ending, because this discourse has been incessantly flooding my timeline lately, so I think I need to say something about it. Warning here, I'm about to be a little bit critical of Undertale, which I hear isn't appreciated around these parts, but oh well. So when everyone is called together by Papyrus before the final battle in the true pacifist ending, Toriel is the first to appear and call out Asgore for his inaction. However, in my opinion, the game does too little to interrogate this, which has led to the resurgence in Toriel criticism, especially in the aftermath of Chapter 4 and people looking at Undertale with fresh eyes. Asgore's treatment, especially in the true pacifist ending, is kind of weird and bad because he basically gets reduced to being the butt of jokes about him being the most divorced guy ever, and while the jokes are funny, they do undermine Asgore's character to an extent, or at least his relevance to that ending in particular, because, Frisk never knew the guy, whereas they've grown close with all of the others at this point. Personally, I prefer the neutral endings for this reason. True Pacifist in general has kind of an issue with tonal whiplash, but I digress. Let's get back to Toriel. So, I of course want to start by addressing the problem here, and it's that Toriel is indeed being kind of a hypocrite. Girl, you also avoided the problem by going back to the ruins, and as I said before, she was seemingly fine with letting the fallen humans wander into Asgore's clutches. It does feel a tad rich for her to be berating Asgore here when she's guilty of a similar crime, albeit to a lesser extent. But I also think recently people have been going in way too hard on her here. For one, I don't think it's inherently unreasonable for her to want to leave her husband after threatening to kill all humans. That's a very understandable thing to have misgivings over. I feel like I see people use this in a fit of anger line as a comeback a lot, but I have a few issues with that. One, we don't know the specifics of Toriel leaving Asgore. Perhaps she did try to talk him out of it, perhaps she didn't. We just don't know, and it's presumptuous to assume Toriel left him in the dust without any discussion. No pun intended. Two, that's just a bad excuse. It was an irrational choice I made in the heat of the moment is what you say when you send a mean text, not when you declare war. I'm not expecting Asgore to be some emotionless robot here. Of course, tension was running high with the fact that both of their children had just died, but it's also his responsibility to be a leader. Toriel was in the same boat and also didn't immediately jump to genocide as the solution. Asgore himself doesn't even expect for that to be a valid excuse, quite honestly. His battle in the neutral ending clearly shows his self-hatred, and he even agrees with Toriel when she calls him a miserable creature. He himself doesn't expect to be forgiven. It's kind of a pretty big part of his character, actually. Another thing is that a lot of the discourse I've seen has missed the point of her argument here. The practicality of her idea isn't an issue, whether it's the dumbest idea or the best idea in the world. Her point was that Asgore was cowardly and not being proactive. Her point wasn't that her plan would somehow result in a lesser loss of life. However, if you want to interpret this in a literal way and criticize the logistics of her idea, people are still so disingenuous about it. Like, we know that humans are stronger than monsters, yeah, but also we are specifically told that Asriel could have easily fought off the humans that were attacking him when he was laying Kara to rest. Asgore is said to be one of the strongest monsters in the Underground, if not the strongest. If little boy Asriel could have fought them off easily, Asgore definitely could have. Also, it's not like violence was even the only option. He could have taken the souls from dying humans or even just borrowed them, since Alpha says that human souls are able to persist when removed from their bodies cause determination. Logistically, Toriel's plan is not a bad idea from most angles. And as I iterated, there is something to be said for Toriel's inaction, but the way people talk about it always puts me off. I think that it is understandable to say that she had a duty as the queen to her people, because it is a pretty bad look for morale when one half of the monarchy just gives up and leaves. It is part of a leader's job to give their people hope, and it's irresponsible to just up and leave when things get bad. Again, Toriel has this issue of avoidance when put in a bad situation. But then I see some people say she had a duty as Asgore's wife, specifically to stay, and that feels very... what do you mean by that? This is a theme we'll see carry over into her criticism in Deltarune as well. Speaking of which, let's move on to Deltarune, because in my opinion this portrayal of her is much more compelling, or at least profound. Deltarune is a comparably much more grounded game than Undertale, Dark Worlds aside. In the Light World, the choice for the cast to primarily consist of monsters is largely a stylistic choice. Another thing is that Chris has lived with Toriel for most of their life, whereas Frisk lived with her for half an hour before continuing on their adventure. Chris can give us a better idea of the type of parent Toriel is when she actually gets the chance to do parenting. So how is she at that? Well, it's complicated. As characters in these games are. So let's start with the area in which Toriel struggles as a parent and work our way up, because I've seen a lot of very questionable takes floating around lately and I have some thoughts on them. Let's talk about Queen a little. As I suggested in my last video, Queen is fairly heavily applied to be representative of the respective parents of the Lightners. Carol is of course the most obvious comparison. Queen genuinely seems to care about Noelle, but expresses it badly and in such a way that restricts Noelle's autonomy. She struggles to understand and connect with Susie, and only seems to have standoffish interactions with her. The flavor text in Berdley's roller coaster battle is very mom-coded, and it paints a very bleak picture of how his mom treats him, rarely giving him the time of day. For a more in-depth analysis, I'll link the Universal Mother Theory by Cookie914 in the iCard, who is, as far as I know, the progenitor of the theory, or at least the first one to put it together in an organized way. And then there's of course Chris. Unlike Susie and Berdley, who Queen is ambivalent at best and hostile at worst to, Queen seems to be kind of fond of Chris, actually. She says that they get her, and she offers to play Punch-Out with them, which they seem receptive to, since they move on their own. However, this doesn't mean she's totally buddy-buddy with them. The reason Chris gets her is because of our control, suppressing their feelings and opinions. Furthermore, there's this consistent motif of Queen and Chris's time to bond being disrupted, be it by traffic jams or Berdley existing. Queen wants to connect with Chris, but she fails to truly understand them, and every time she gets the chance to, their time together is interrupted. Not to mention, Queen has a propensity for getting tipsy when Chris wants to connect with her, see the toast flavor text. And yeah, that's all pretty spot on with Toriel. From chapter 1, it's pretty clear that Toriel and Chris's relationship is a bit strained at least, with her expressing that things have felt lonelier since Asgore and Asriel had left and it was just them. While Asriel was the outgoing golden boy, Toriel struggled to really get Chris. I think that's actually the symbolic meaning of Chris eating the pie. While of course it's partially just a funny because chapter 1 ended on such a suspenseful note, pie is an important symbol in both Undertale and Deltarune. It's representative of family bonds. Toriel gives Frisk a slice of pie at the very end of the game after adopting them. Asgore has a bunch of botched pie recipes in a new home because he's failing to recapture the memories of his now broken family. Toriel makes a pie with Susie as a way to welcome her into their home. However, in both instances, the pie is not shared. In chapter 1 it's hogged by Chris, and in chapter 2, Chris is too busy slashing tires to get any. And I don't think it's a coincidence that both of these instances relate to Chris having a soul episode. It's not a stretch to say that Chris's soul troubles are a reflection of their personal struggles with identity and mental health, even before our advent. Noelle says that Chris used to take Carol's heart pillows and chase her around saying they tore out their heart, and apparently the wagon with the birdcage that houses us has seen a lot of crashes. Aram taunts Chris in the weird route by saying they could blame it on us while still taking enjoyment in it. A very compelling take I've seen is that Chris removing their soul is a form of self-harm. It's a way for them to depersonalize in a world they don't feel gets them. This is further evidenced by Toriel's dismissive "Chris does this sometimes" during the tire slashing incident and the bloodstain near the wagon. And circling back to my point, that's the crux of the problem. Toriel, much like her husband and son and dead child, smiles and nods her way through her problems. It doesn't help that even before us, Chris was likely pretty reticent about their internal struggles. Toriel already has a lot on her plate as is, so it makes sense that she would turn to this don't ask, don't tell style of parenting. I find it quite sad that Noelle is the only one who notices, or at least makes specific mention of, Chris's unusual behavior with us puppeteering them, not either of their parents. Of course, one would also be remiss not to mention the end of Chapter 4 here too, as it's far and away the most egregious example, but we're getting there. We'll just wait. However, even with all of this in mind, a lot of the discourse seems to conflate Toriel struggling to connect with Chris with her being uninterested in connecting with them altogether, which is patently untrue. Again, look at Queen, she clearly wants to connect with Chris. For some reason, I've seen a lot of people point to Toriel checking out the How to Care for Humans book as evidence that she's like a bad parent or something, and I need someone to explain this to me because I do not understand how on God's green earth you can interpret this that way. If anything, I think it shows that Toriel's clearly putting forth an effort to understand Chris better, she isn't just trying to coast by. Chris's discomfort seems to be in response to seeing other humans, perhaps related to a past trauma of theirs. I think her checking out the book repeatedly could definitely be read as sad and reflect Chris's feeling that she just doesn't get them. But by no means does this show she's a bad parent at all. Another really stupid thing is Toriel's responses to Asgore's quite frankly very creepy behavior. While in the grocery store scene you could argue that it was just a coincidence, he was literally waiting to ambush her with flowers in Chapter 4. While perhaps Toriel could have been more assertive in this scene, and she did kind of ditch Chris and Susie, Asgore is just as guilty of the same crime. He just dumps his stupid flowers on Chris without so much as addressing Susie before running off to go pee on Carol's flowers or whatever he's doing. And I feel the need to emphasize that ultimately the lion's share of the blame falls on Asgore here. This is incredibly inappropriate, and if I were Chris I would find this just as, if not more embarrassing than the dancing scene, and for Toriel's part, she very much has a right to be, and I'd also want to get out of there. At best, I'd feel deeply awkward, and at worst, I would hope this didn't escalate into something more serious. Let's talk about Asgore a little more, because frankly the way the fandom scrutinizes Toriel so much more than Asgore is pissing me off. I am the original Starwalker, by the way. I just want to do a lightning round of things people always get on Toriel's ass about, but never or rarely Asgore's. Emotional unavailability. I just touched on this, but in his couple of mandatory scenes in Chapter 4, Asgore does not exactly put his best foot forward parenting-wise. People act like Chris has some force field around them that will summon Toriel if Asgore is too close to them. Toriel has never forbade Asgore from speaking to Chris, not even close. While we have tangible demonstrations of Toriel trying to put forth efforts to bond with Chris, no such examples except for their weird route crash out exist with Asgore. In the church scene, he just ditches them with the flowers, and in the scene where Carol kicks everyone out, he could have walked them home or something. Not to mention he never even asks Susie for her name or anything. And again, compare that to Toriel, who literally gave Susie lunch when she didn't even know who she was. My point here is that Toriel is not by any means, except for not letting him live at her house, blocking Chris from seeing him, and Asgore is not putting forth any more effort than Toriel, but receives significantly less scrutiny. Embarrassing Chris. For some reason, I've seen a lot of people act like the problem in the dancing scene was that Toriel was embarrassing Chris, and while I'm sure that's true, it's not the fundamental problem. Still though, I want to cover all my bases here. As I said before, Asgore's behavior is also incredibly pathetic and very embarrassing for Chris, but I won't prattle on about it longer because I've made my point abundantly clear. Not acknowledging or being aware of Chris's condition. Again, people get all over Toriel for not being able to see the clear signs that something is wrong with Chris, which, again, is not really true. This interaction with Alfie suggests that something is worrying her, but she's likely too afraid to ask about it because of how closed off they are. Again, it's a don't ask, don't tell kind of parenting, which I should emphasize is not great, but she also can't force Chris to talk about their feelings. Also, Toriel doesn't know that there's any supernatural stuff going on in town. She probably just assumed that Chris finally making an actual close friend since Noelle is what's shaken up their attitude. Asgore, meanwhile, is presumably aware of the supernatural events, and again, he is hardly the most present parent. I doubt Asgore is aware of Chris's possession. Putting his children at risk is not a gambit he'd be willing to make, but Toriel has a much better excuse than he does. All of this may make it seem like I hate Asgore or think he's a bad parent. I don't, not at all. I think Asgore is a fantastic character in both Undertale and Deltarune, and he's also really hot. I mean, who said that? And I don't think he's necessarily a bad parent either. However, the hypocrisy and to an extent victim blaming on display is unavoidable. Toriel is not obligated to have a conversation with him, let alone when he randomly ambushes her with unsolicited flowers and she's made it as clear as she can while still being polite that she's not interested. If she was more assertive and told Asgore straight up that she's done dealing with his ridiculousness and to buzz off, I guarantee you that people would immediately start calling her a mean witch who just won't let the poor man say his piece. Why is parenting Chris solely the responsibility of Toriel, but it's acceptable for Asgore to waste his time chasing Toriel around and playing detective? And yes, I have seen plenty of discussion about Asgore's obsession with Des, but mostly just in the context of theories, and not how it impacts the people around him. It's no wonder that Chris doesn't like looking at conspiracy boards. Asgore aside, though, it's gotten to the point that I've seen people just post straight-up lies about Toriel's character, like, straight-up untruths. Someone made a post about this dialogue where Susie understands Chris's dysphoria about their lack of horns. This quote tweet with over 40,000 likes says that she recognized what Toriel couldn't in her entire time raising Chris, which is just... What? What are you even talking about? This is just patently untrue. Do you really think that Toriel is so dense that she didn't understand why Chris wanted horns? I guess if you're really reaching, she's not addressing the underlying problem, but like, the intention was clear here. She bought them because she wanted to help them feel more like they fit in with their family. Again, she's not stupid, just avoidant, and even then, this was clearly a very altruistic action on her part. And, of course, this leads to the culmination of the discourse. The moment you've all been waiting for, the dancing scene. So first, let's get one thing straight. This scene isn't just meant to be a haha funny. Yes, that is part of it, and I love the pairing of Sans and Toriel, I've shipped them since Undertale, but to act like this scene has no depth outside of that is an insult to Toby as a writer. While Deltarune has its fair share of non-sequitur jokes, the most intense and drama-filled chapter thus far would not end on such an arbitrary note, and it wouldn't drive Chris to crash out like that if it wasn't meant to communicate something. So let's discuss. Let's get the obvious out of the way here first. It is indeed very irresponsible of Toriel to get sloshed and dance around while her child's whereabouts are unknown, and last night there was apparently a tire-slashing maniac at large, and it's also 1 in the morning. Chris and Susie are also clearly very uncomfortable, and considering the implications of her home life, I imagine that was a very off-putting situation for Susie, especially since Toriel is like the only adult she trusts. It doesn't help that they just went through hell and back to try and save her, and while she is of course unaware of that fact, it makes it sting all the more for them. However, I do think people have taken interpretations of this scene to their very extremes. For one, I see people saying that Toriel's an alcoholic because of this scene, which, like, no, that's not what that word means. Toriel is an irresponsible drinker, that much is evident in the alarm clock dialogue, but alcoholism is a dependence on alcohol. Before Chapter 4, the only implication Toriel drank at all was Rudy's dialogue about her being a party animal. I'd hardly call that a dependence. Also, a lot of people seem to see it as an inherent problem that Toriel is partying with Sans at all, which... no. The issue is that she did that while her child was unaccounted for. Again, Toriel's a really busy woman, being one of the town's only 2 teachers and the community figure as the choir director, and that, combined with the fact that her child is acting weird, her son is coming home soon, her ex won't leave her alone, and her smile and nod through hard times coping strategy, probably led to this. She let off all that steam at once, and while that of course doesn't justify that she forgot about Chris and Susie at all, it does make it more sympathetic. The community also seems to be kind of obsessed with trying to force Toriel and Asgore back together when she's, as I've iterated, clearly not interested. Asgore needs to move the hell on, and Toriel is allowed to seek other options. It feels in the same vein as Breaking Bad fans getting mad at Skylar White for cheating on Walt when she ended their relationship already. Again, the issue is not that she's interested in Sans. Sans' role in this also needs to be acknowledged. I think the fandom has actually vilified Sans quite a bit after this incident, but still, I want to mention it. Sans does not seem as drunk as Toriel, but still he encourages her irresponsible behavior. When she expresses concern for Susie, he dismisses it and gets right back to dancing, and like, surely he was aware that Chris was unaccounted for. He actually would fit perfectly among the Dreamers, considering he's the absolute king of grinning and bearing it. Again, I won't dwell on this too long, since that's an analysis of its own, and the fandom has already made their contempt clear, as they should. All of the discourse in response to this scene feels very symptomatic of a Deltarune fandom that's a bit overeager to correct for their former sins. Toriel is hardly the first case of this, Chris is another good example. In the Chapter 1 era, people were like, they're possessed by Kara and they're gonna murder everyone, And then by Chapter 2, when people realized that we are possessing them and their bad actions could be attributed to us, there was this knee-jerk desire to defend Chris at all costs to rectify our past slights against them. This unfortunately led to Chris's agency being erased entirely, and people shutting down the idea that they could have any kind of ulterior motive. In a similar but opposite way, Toriel, who was for the better part of 10 years the wholesome goat mom without much more to her, was so viciously turned against when people finally realized that she's not a perfect parent. The dancing scene was just the straw that broke the camel's back, the ultimate crescendo to this building discourse. In an effort to overcorrect for their past mistakes, fans leaned so hard into criticizing her for every little minute thing. She isn't perfect, but nobody in these games are. Stuffed Alpaca's video about gender in Deltarune, which I very highly recommend, describes it as like the mother version of a Madonna whore complex, which I think is a very astute comparison. A lot of it also feels reflective of the way we as a society treat single mothers, and that is to say unfairly. They're caught in this impossible balancing act where they have to be major breadwinners while also being emotionally and physically available while doing double the work of a normal couple. And yeah, that's absolutely how people treat Toriel. She's a very active woman, and she's expected to have double the workload of the average parent, and while I can certainly understand Chris's frustration, we as the audience are not Chris. We, as an objective third party, can recognize that Toriel is in a uniquely difficult spot with all of these overlapping parts of her life that would drive her to take the edge off all at once. This game does not exist in a vacuum. So, in conclusion, is Toriel a perfect parent? No, of course not. But is she a bad parent? Also no, not by any stretch. She clearly cares very deeply for Chris and wants to bond with them, but because of, well, circumstances, she struggles with it. And like literally every single character in these games, she is very nuanced. And I can't help but notice that with the more profound male characters like Asgore or Sans, the fandom is immediately ready to go, wow, this is such a deep and good and interesting character. But when you have a Toriel or an Alphys doing more unsavory things, people immediately jump to the worst possible conclusion, which is a tad ironic given that one of the biggest themes in both Undertale and Deltarune is seeing the good in people. But with that being said, that is all I have for Toriel. Thank you so much for watching. I know I said my next video was going to be FNAF, but I was having such bad writer's block with it, and Deltarune is still at the forefront of my mind, so you're going to have to deal with this for a little while longer, I'm sorry. However, I don't have any specific ideas for another Deltarune video after this, and I do have a backlog of FNAF video ideas, so I might pivot from my old idea to another one I had relating to Secret of the Mimic, also relating to everyone's favorite group, women, yay! Hi, sorry the audio quality is worse, but also, I wanted to share that while I was editing this, I'm happy to report that I have now hit 4,000 subscribers, which is so super exciting. This, like, stupid hobby of mine of just talking about my hyperfixations on YouTube is actually starting to net me some money, and people are paying attention to what I have to say and having discussions with me, and I think that's really cool. Okay, that's it. As always, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like, leave a comment, maybe even subscribe if you're feeling a bit frisky, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye-bye!